Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Beth Chats Books. Now today's video is going to be the worst reads of 2020. Now I am going to do a small caveat here and say that these are not necessarily bad books. They were just the books that I rated the lowest in 2020. These will appeal to some readers, they'll really enjoy them. But for me, they just didn't cut the mustard, okay? So it's not personal against these authors. A lot of these authors, I would read other works from them again in the future. But some authors, like one I will mention who two of their books are mentioned in the worst reads video, I just don't think they're for me. And that's fine. The right cup of tea for some people, but they just were not for me. So anyway, let's just get stuck in. So the very first one is Three Women by Lisa Taddeo. Now, I forgot that I read this book this year because 2020 has felt like it's gone on forever. And this actually feels like a completely different me that read this book than the me that is bringing in 2021. So, yeah, I am gonna, rack through my brains for this one. But I remember that the writing style was quite good in this book, but the subject matter was really frustrating for me. So this is meant to be a non-fiction about female desire. Now, the more I reflect on this book, the more I feel like Lisa Taddeo exploited the stories of these women to make a compelling non-fiction. So I think Lisa wanted this to be a bit like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, to be compelling, to be that propulsive non-fiction that reads like fiction. But it was at the expense of people's stories. Now, these three women share their sexual experiences, and I don't think they were treated tactfully and appropriately in this book. This is weaved in parts where Lisa Taddeo is almost assuming how these characters feel, how these people feel, because she doesn't really have a testimony that talks in detail about certain parts of the story that these women are giving, so she has to fill in the gaps for certain bits, and I think she just doesn't do that very well. I think she belittles some of these women's experiences by filling it in and making it seem more romantic than it really was. For example, one of the characters in here is based on a woman who's come forward to tell her about experience of having a relationship with a teacher, and she ends up having a sexual relationship with the teacher, and then years later reflects on it when she comes out about it, and her whole community turn against her and think that she's lying. There's nothing about desire in that. That's exploitation of a minor, and that's not female desire to me. That doesn't express it in any way, shape or form, and to go down that route of putting it in a book about women's female desire is very problematic to me. Wasn't happy with that. And then there's a lady who she kind of has sexual relationships with her husband and with other men and records it for her husband. Again, I don't think that represents the overall umbrella of female sexual desire. She is having sex with men for her husband's sexual desire, not for hers. It doesn't really feel like empowering for this particular woman. It doesn't feel like she feels empowered by it. I find that a really problematic expression of female desire. And then the final one deals with a lady who gets back in contact with a childhood sweetheart, has an affair with him, and he couldn't give a shit about her. He just meets her in the middle of the woods, has sex with her in his van, and then goes back off to his normal life. He doesn't really say anything complimentary about her. And it's very sad. She's stuck in a marriage where her husband won't physically touch her, and she gets all this love and affection from this, all I can refer to is pretty much a douchebag of a human being. And again, where is her desire? It's not there. This is all about how men exploit women, in my opinion. It does not make for a book about female desire, so I'm sorry. No, this just not cut the mustard with me, and I think a lot of people feel similarly about this book, and I'm quite surprised that even a year later because I think I read this really early in 2020. I still obviously feel as passionate about that, so there's that one. Then I read Fleischman is in Trouble by Brodessa Akner. I'm sorry, I'm just going to bring my coffee because the next few books that I'm going to show you are just going to be digital because I don't have them to hand. I have ended up culling this from my shelves because I didn't want it on my bookshelves anymore because I didn't really care about it. So this book follows a gentleman who is having a marriage breakdown with his wife, and he's separated, and he uses dating apps and he tries to find himself, and he slags his ex-wife off, and he's not really that present with his kids. I can't even really remember there being any substantial plot at all. It's just a dude doing his thing, and, you know, constantly a lot of the book is taken up with him kind of using these dating apps and seeing women as kind of sexual exploitations that he wants to engage in, and really feeling great about himself, and just a dig at his ex-wife that I don't really care about his story, his experience. There was nothing that compelled me to know anything about who he was, who his wife was, what the hell the story was about. And I remember that the ending was really disappointing, and a lot of people just DNF this, and I really think that if you wanted to DNF it, there's no issue with it. I wanted to finish it to say I had, and it was on the BookTube prize reading this year, but I can't even tangibly remember anything about the book now, which says a whole lot about it, because that's all I remember, him and his dating apps. To be honest, I don't really remember any substantial plot. I know that it was quite problematic because it was also on the Women's Prize long list this year, which caused a lot of controversy because it's a male story but written by a female, but it's about a male character's life, and I think that doesn't really add anything to the general plethora of women's fiction. We have enough about men's stories and their sexual exploitations with women. It didn't really add anything to the stratosphere of literature in general. So that's all I'm going to say on it, because that's literally all I remember about it. So there's that one. Then I read The Starlight C by Eric Morgenstern. This was a huge disappointment. So the very first half of the book I was super into. It was building up this world where it was ingraining the love of books and libraries, and how the character takes out a book in the library and finds out that it's kind of a story, a different world, and that they're written into the story. It was fantastical. It made me feel a bit like Harry Potter, but it also had that nerdy library book lover element that I really, really loved, and I thought I was really going to enjoy it. And then the plot just got ridiculous for me. I'm not big into fantasy, and maybe that is one of the main issues I had, but I think the plot just dragged out for far, far, far too long. The last quarter could have been snipped. And I was kind of getting to the point in the last quarter where I was wondering where all this fantasy build-up was leading, what was the point? And the execution of the fantasy elements was done pretty poorly, and there was a lot of loose threads that weren't weaved together very well. And I lost the coziness of the beginning of the book and that cozy fantasy, because it kind of just went off base. I think a lot of people have quite liked it. I really want to read The Night Circus by this author because everybody says that's the better work. But yeah, the last quarter in particular, I was just really struggling to understand where we were going with this book. I think the writing was good, but the fantasy, the execution, the plotting was just poor in my opinion. So yeah, I really didn't enjoy that reading experience. So then the next book that's on the list is Strange Hotel by Emma McBride. I also have to add that there is a second Emma McBride book that is also on this worst books of 2020 list, and that is A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing as well. Now, I don't think Emma McBride is an author for me. I think her stream of consciousness style is very difficult for me to get into. Now, I have previously read stream of consciousness writing and really enjoyed it. I loved Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, but this the sentences run on with one another, and it uses Irish dialect, which is quite confusing. You can't really read her style of writing on the page. You kind of have to speak it out loud to get anything out of it. But I find it very hard to connect with her style. So Strange Hotel follows a character, and she's reflecting on a past relationship, and she's having a sexual experience with somebody else in a hotel on her own, and reflecting on past hotels that she's stayed in. It's very still. Nothing really kind of happens. It reflects this character briefly, a kind of a harmless flirting with somebody else in the hotel that progresses to sex, and it feels lonely and stilted and disjointed, and for some people that those might be massive buzzwords that make them think, yeah, I'd love it. I didn't get it. Maybe with Emma McBride what I really struggle is I just don't get her and her writing. I don't get it. I don't have that connection to it, and I feel isolated from the author when I read her works. And it's a shame because a lot of people love Emma McBride, and maybe it's just not something I'm ever gonna feel passionate about, her style and her works. A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing focused more on a woman and an abusive relationship that she was having with an older man. I can't remember whether it was a family or a stepfather or something like that. I can't remember, but there was a older man, and it was an inappropriate sexual relationship, and her brother was ill, and that had more of a tangible plot, but the style was really jarring for me. And because you don't really read many books in the style of writing that Emma McBride does, I found even though the book was very small and I took it out of the library, I really struggled through it, and maybe I'm just not in the right headspace to read her. But now that I've tried 2 of her books, I'm kind of sufficiently confident that I won't really pick anything else by her up in the foreseeable future, because I just think me and her just don't have a connection. But A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing seems to get a lot more praise than Strange Hotel, and I haven't really heard many people buzzing about Strange Hotel recently, even though it came out this year, so maybe people feel the same way. But there's that. Also, I just want to say that none of these go in a particular order. These are a rough worst reads of 2020, but there's not any that's particularly worse than the others. So this is just a generalised debrief, kind of casual chat about these, because I find with worse books it's actually harder to talk about them, especially reflecting back on them, because your brain, when they're not that great, kind of sieves them out of your mind, and I think your favourites are the ones that you kind of remember the plot a lot better. So, and then the next one is Wacky on the Junk by Kathy Varner, and this was one that I got as a reviewer copy from the Voracious Readers Only website, and this is a non-fiction autobiography about Kathy Varner's life. I remember I had a lot of niggles with the spelling and grammar in this book. It did not read well. The writing was just not good. The structure of this was not good. And I remember being peeved every time I read it because there were certain things like glaring errors that I could see on the page that kind of just took me out of the story a little bit. I can't actually really remember much about the actual story of her life. If I can have a quick flick in my reader's journal and see if that comes up with anything. Okay, so I actually obviously can write things down a lot more coherently than I can remember them. So it says here that the structure quite disruptive. So it often had the title of the book wedged in between the text, and I think it was just because of the proof edition that I had, but I found that was really jarring when I was reading it. And I've mentioned here how I think too many subjects were being jam-packed into one book that could have been dealt with in separate books. So she mentions about her experience as being a paralegal in the child services, and her battle with mental depression and her parents' dementia, other things. So she dealt with a lot of topics that didn't coordinate with one another and wasn't structured in a way that was accessible. And I think some of the fantastic memoirs that have come out in 2020 and that I've read in 2020, which some I will mention in my best books of 2020, they had that one main focus about that point in somebody's life, and we progress through that, and I find they are much more successful memoirs than if you literally try to tell every part of your life from birth up until present day. It's just too much for a reader to stay engaged with. So yeah, I just remember finding this more of a frustrating reading experience than a pleasurable one. Then the next one is Girl in the Walls by AJ News or Gnews. I still never know how to say that. And this I read recently, and it was a NetGalley proof. And I really wanted to enjoy this book, but I got about a quarter of the way in and realised that the plot had kind of backed itself into a corner that it couldn't get out of, and it made for a pointless plot development. So the concept is that a girl is literally living in the walls. Her parents had a car accident and she returns to the house and she hides in the attic, and she basically just lives in the house, and a new family move in and they have suspicions that there's strange noises in the house and it's her. But obviously as a plot, where do you go from there? This whole book was a novel, and it might have been more successful as a novella, but the author didn't really allow themselves much space to grow, and the character development wasn't that interesting. It was just an isolated family and this little girl, and I got bored. I got bored in the last 100 pages or so, because I was kind of thinking, well, where's this going to end? Especially because she was tangible. It wasn't potentially a ghost story, it wasn't a mystery. We knew from the beginning she was literally living in the walls, so where do you go from there is my opinion, and I was just a little bit overall disappointed by it. And then the next book I read that I really did not like was Breakfast at Tiffanys by Truman Capote. Now, Truman Capote I absolutely adored in Cold Blood, and I have no beef with Truman Capote based on reading this. I just think this was vastly different than in Cold Blood, and I did not like the main character in this novella. So Breakfast at Tiffanys, a lot of people have seen the film. I've never seen the film. I would like to watch it at some point. But it follows a lady who is obviously gorgeous. Everybody talks in this novella, considering it's quite short, about how amazing she is. These characters, particularly male characters, swoon over her. She's a bit all over the place. She's a party girl, drinking, and I feel like we've just seen and heard these stories before about a beautiful woman who is a party animal, who lives a tragic life, and that's it. You know, we've seen characters like Marilyn Monroe and other icons who are beautiful and everyone adores them, but they have this sad and lonely life behind closed doors. So that is basically the plot, you know, and I can't even remember how it ends, so that's all I remember, that she was having a lot of parties, and the narrator is one of the males in the story who adores her and reflects on where did she go and who was she, and that brief eclipse of time in which he was there with the character and saw her at her heyday, her party days. Yeah, dull. Just dull. No, thank you. Last book that I want to mention is The Innocents by Michael Crummy. Now, me and Michael Crummy and The Innocents have had a little bit of a relationship this year. And when I mentioned in my last video for the BookTube Prize reading, I said it wasn't a bad book, and it's not a bad book. But I'm putting it on this list because it was not for me. And I don't think no amount of sugarcoating it is going to change the fact that me and this book were not meant to be. So it follows two children who live in Newfoundland, and it's set in the 17th century, and they're completely isolated in this rural isolated area of Canada, and their parents die and their little sister dies, and they have to live together, and then they enter puberty at a similar time, and they kind of explore all of that through a physical relationship with each other, even though they are brother and sister. So this obviously is trigger warning for incestual relationships that are very uncomfortable to read about. And, you know, they briefly have other characters come in to help push the story along minimally, because they have to live off the land and they have to trade and things. But it's very slow, very sparsely written. It's just these two characters. Did not like the incest in it. I know that for a lot of people it didn't really bother them, and I'm not really squeamish, but obviously I don't choose to read books about things like that. So I did find it quite hard to stomach those bits. They just made me uncomfortable. You know, call me a weirdo, but reading about incest does not make me feel very comfortable. And then the rest of the plot is just so slow, and I'm not somebody who needs a massive amount of plot. I love character development, and I love going back into people's past and piecing together that, and I love family history in fiction as well, piecing together who their family was and going to different stories and spending time. But I hate just no plot at all. I hate if we're in present day and we're just staying in present day but nothing's actually happening. If we're going back in time or we're going forward in time and we kind of get a break of a different perspective and then we go back, then it doesn't really feel as frustrating for me to read about. But I think when we're just in a current present timeline that doesn't develop and the characters don't develop and there's nothing new happening, obviously it's a survival story fiction, they're not really great for me. So I think maybe I might be the kind of person that might not like Armageddon kind of end of the world fiction, apocalypse fiction, because of for that very reason, where there's literally nothing happening but survival. But I haven't read many of those, so I don't know, maybe I'll find one that I'll love. But anyway, sidetracking myself as usual. Those are all the books. Now, I didn't want to spend too long on this video because, one, like I mentioned, it's very hard to remember all the plots anyway, a year in reflection. And two, I don't like being overly negative. So I wanted to get this worst books of 2020 video out of the way, and then I can give you my best books of 2020 and a book haul, and then we can all end the year on a happy note, because I know it's been a rubbish year, but we have to stay positive. We just have to keep getting through it. That's my philosophy anyway, even though we're now basically all in tier 4 in the UK. But anyway, let's stay positive. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.